From Social Prosperity Partners, this is Community Catalysts.
I don't think that what Dave Albo wants matters at all. I'm there to do what the vast majority of my constituents want me to do.
Welcome to Community Catalysts. I'm your host, Matt Lehrman. Every strong community has people who choose to step up and lead. Some hold elected office, others are hired into positions of trust and authority, and many are called through service, advocacy, or simple determination to make things better. However they arrive, each leader carries hard-earned lessons, stories of challenge, perseverance, and purpose. That's what we do here on this podcast, real conversations with real leaders. By sharing their journeys, the missteps, as well as the breakthroughs, we all gain insight into what it takes to guide communities with integrity, resilience, and heart. Today's episode is part of a monthly series sponsored by RELI, the Regional Elected Leaders Initiative at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. RELI supports and connects regional leaders across Northern Virginia, equipping them to tackle complex challenges through collaboration and innovation. And by sponsoring this episode, RELI is sharing those insights with local leaders everywhere, and we are truly grateful for that. My guest today is Dave Albo. For nearly 24 years, he represented Northern Virginia in the Virginia House of Delegates, including 12 years as chairman of the House Courts of Justice Committee, the legislature's central committee for criminal, civil, and judicial matters. Since 2018, Dave has continued that work in a different way as a government relations attorney at Williams-Moen, where he represents corporations, associations, and public entities before Virginia's legislative and executive branches. And I'm especially looking forward to exploring with him kind of an insider's and outsider's perspective on what it takes to get really big and important things done. Dave Albo, welcome to Community Catalysts.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dave, to prepare for this interview, I asked you to cite an experience from early in your career that really stuck with you. And you mentioned serving as a prosecutor and as a guardian ad litem on behalf of abused and neglected children. I'd kind of like to start there. Tell us about that experience, and what did you learn about responsibility and leadership that's been meaningful to you throughout your career?
I was a prosecutor for the city of Fairfax for traffic court and misdemeanor court. That was the most fun I've ever had working. You would go into court. You wouldn't know what cases you'd have. All the cases with attorneys would be put on your lap. It'd be about 30. You might have 10 DUIs and 5 reckless and 2 assault and battery cases. And you had to listen to police officers, listen to the defense attorneys, figure out whether you're cutting a deal or whether you're going to trial, and all got it done within 2 or 3 hours. And you learn, it's like drinking from a fire hose, or especially if you want to be a trial lawyer. It paid poorly because that's what public service is about. Because I've always said the most fun jobs always pay poorly.
Yeah.
The other one, guardian abused children, would be a job that you do because it's the right thing to do, but it ain't fun. One thing I learned about child abuse is that it happens everywhere. It's not just in quote unquote crime neighborhoods. It's in suburbia and everywhere. And it's very fulfilling, but it's heartbreaking.
And what about that has stuck with you through your career? What has that helped you keep an eye on or informed about what you've done since?
Well, as far as the guardian ad litem, I don't think it's helped me in my career. It's made me appreciate having good parents. And a lot of people don't have that. So when I became a legislator, it gave me a lot more empathy for people who are less fortunate than myself. The prosecutor thing is just, I don't know. I wish I could tell you it had some kind of life-changing event. It was just fun, and it helped me become a better lawyer.
I have to share a personal thing. More than a decade ago, our youngest came home from freshman year of college, and she said, "Mom, Dad, I want to be a child advocate." And we said, "Great. What does that mean?" And she was home for winter break. I called up the court system, and I discovered that there was not just a special court, they called it a baby court. There was a special court for only handling child issues where the kids were under 2 years old. And I took my daughter. We went and spent the day sitting in the courtroom, getting to see what those proceedings were like. And that's where I got to learn what a guardian ad litem is. And I got to understand what that system looks like. I have to tell you, it had a huge impact on me. Daughter is still working in the field of child advocacy and education and families, but my goodness, I worked in the nonprofit arts and cultural sector, and I thought we had a lock on passion and emotion. What I saw happen in the courtroom dealing with the disposition of young children, it was so meaningful and so moving, and the impetus to make decisions quickly because those kids are only going to be kids for a short period of time. That's incredibly important, very demanding kind of work. I have to imagine some of that stuck with you.
Well, when I was chairman of the Courts of Justice Committee, we would have hearings, like legislative hearings on these things, and just the stories that come to you. Sometimes we'd have to shut the room down for the public to keep the privacy of the individuals who are testifying. But yeah, I mean, I thought being a legislator is not, every time someone runs for office, say, as a woman or as an older person or as a young person, I understand. I've always thought that that's not what being a legislator is about. Because you can't understand anybody really but yourself. Your job is to try to understand what it's like to be someone else and to try to put yourselves in their shoes so you can make the best decisions for people. And that whole garden ad litem thing made me appreciate what it was like to maybe be poor or to have a dad who's a drug addict or, have a mom who beats you. It taught me how to put myself in other people's shoes and see the world through their eyes.
Yeah, to see the world not as policy, but as people.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Is that experience directly connected to why you wanted to serve on the Courts of Justice Committee? And could I ask you to explain in fuller detail what that committee's charge was exactly?
The Courts of Justice Committee is basically anything you see in court. So it's all the criminal laws, divorce laws, contract laws, real estate laws, anything that a lawyer would deal with in court. And so it hears more bills than any other committee in the General Assembly. I always wanted to be on it because I was a trial lawyer, mostly criminal defense, and as a prosecutor also. So I had some background knowledge on it. It teaches you one thing that I don't think people really realize, that every word in the Virginia Code was put there on purpose. As a bad example, I remember we had a bill that used the word which instead of the word that, and which is a non-limiting pronoun and that is a limiting pronoun, and it made a difference, and we argued about it for an hour.
You served as the chair of this committee for a rather long period of time. You should explain the context of that.
Well, 12 years. So when I retired from the House of Delegates, the clerk informed me that I was the longest serving member in the history of Virginia, which at that time was over 400 years. Which I thought was really cool. And it's always good to have some knucklehead friends who can bring you down when you think you're too hot. So my friend said, yeah, but life expectancy was only 28 back then. So adjusted for life expectancy, it's really not that big a deal.
Tell me more about the reason why you wanted to stick with that committee. I imagine, serving in the legislature so long, you had your pick. You had seniority. You could have served in a lot of different places. Why this?
I was asked to serve in appropriations, but my talent is not keeping a checkbook. My talent, I thought, was more about learning how the world works in court and knowing how to make laws that make sense and actually work. And weirdly enough, it was the most fascinating job I've ever had. We would sometimes meet till 3 a.m. going over bills. It was just fascinating. The other thing you learn too is one person can read the same words one way and it means one thing. Another person can read those words and it means something else. And so in legislative drafting, you learn about just because you read it a certain way doesn't mean everybody's going to. And so trying to make sure that everybody can find a language that's a common denominator where everybody would understand it.
What advice do you have for someone in local government who is not a lawyer and perhaps not a technician on the way policy should be worded?
One thing we used to do, a little trick that we developed when I was there was if things got complicated, we'd say, stop, let's start over again. Explain it to me like I'm in 8th grade. explain it to me in regular words an eighth grader can understand. And then once we would explain what the problem was and what we thought the solution was in regular person speak, then we would start writing it in the Virginia Code. So to make sure everybody was on the same page, kind of simplify it and talk at an eighth grade level, and then start writing it into the ordinance or the code.
Dave, you remind me of a college professor I had. I was a government major years ago, and maybe you had the same experience. We had an assignment where we had to come in with the written on an index card, the instructions to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And the professor showed up with the loaf of bread, in the plastic wrap, and the jars of peanut butter and jelly and the knife. And he would follow the directions literally. And of course, it was a complete mess because no one could specifically write the directions in a way that anyone could actually follow. That's kind of where your point goes to as well, is we have to boil this down to such simplicity that people really understand not just the intention, but make sure that what we're writing actually gets us to that intention.
Yeah, and the stakes are pretty high in criminal law because if you make a mistake, people can go to jail who shouldn't be going to jail, and you can ruin people's lives. You got to make sure that the words are right.
So a which and a that really matters.
Mm-hmm. I can bore you with with the example.
Give me an example. I'd love to hear it. Yeah, we'd all love to hear it.
So the code said that a police officer can prove somebody speeding by using radar, a laser, or a microcomputer, which is connected to an odometer cable. Only microcomputers are connected to odometer cables. So you could go to court as a lawyer and the police officer say, I got him on radar. And you would say, is that connected to an odometer cable? And the police officer say, no, I move to dismiss. The radar is not connected to an odometer cable. And then the prosecutor would say, but it doesn't have to be. Only the microcomputer has to be connected to the odometer cable. And then I would say, which is not a limiting pronoun. It modifies laser and radar. If you wanted to fix it, you need to change which to that so that connected to an odometer cable only applies to a microcomputer. And got the Strunk and White's Elements of Style from 8th grade, showed a judge as a non-limiting pronoun, and win the case. And then once we won that case, my job in the wintertime was to go to the General Assembly and fix mistakes in the code. And so we struck the word which and inserted that. That's all the bill did. But it's a really illustrative case study on how words matter and how you can screw things up by using the wrong words.
I can honestly say I'm really glad I didn't go to law school. But I'm really glad that there are people who understand the significance of that. I get the importance of it. Dave, let's fast forward, because I really would like to do a deep dive into what I understand is one of the most consequential matters that you worked on. In 2013, Virginia approved a sweeping transportation funding package, I believe the largest in the state's history. You were at the center of that effort, and I understand it was particularly significant for Northern Virginia, where traffic and infrastructure challenges were most severe. Can I ask you to take us back to that time? What was happening that made this legislation so urgent?
Really, it was what was not happening, which was no construction. So I had pulled some notes over a decade ago, so I don't remember a lot of it. But here was the problem. In 1986, last time gas tax was increased, it cost $25,000 to repave a mile of road. And today, meaning 2013, when I wrote this, it cost $80. So the state was raising 17.5 cents to build a $25,000 road, but they needed to be raising enough money to build an $80,000, repave an $80,000 road. Second thing is fuel efficiency. In 1985, the average car got 17.5 miles to gallon, and in 2007, it got 22. And, we mentioned electric cars, which is kind of a recent thing. I mean, it's got to be worse. And you're still only raising 17.5 cents a gallon. So back prior to 2013. This took me about 8 years to pass. But there was so little money in transportation, and this is not even hyperbole. I couldn't even get a stoplight funded in my district. There was not enough money to put one stoplight in all of Virginia. And so a number of us from Northern Virginia, where transportation is at the time, it probably still is the number one issue, we were under a lot of pressure to solve the problem. It was a Republican majority back then, so raising taxes was a big no-no.
Mm-hmm.
I spent years trying to find cuts. Found out and I learned that 38% of the budget at the time was K through 12 in higher education. 28% was Medicaid. 14% was public safety. 3.8% was debt service. 1.2% was rainy day fund. And we have this big, very popular car tax rebate repeal here in Virginia. That was 5.5% of the budget, which only left 10% of the budget. But you'd have to cut everything else. Everything wasn't on that list. You'd have to totally eliminate and move it to transportation. So I had to justify to my Republican friends that there's just no way to do it through cuts. And that was not an easy lift. But, we sat down and explained this to people, and they eventually understood. Many of my Republican friends didn't agree because it was against their religion, so to speak, to raise taxes. But I said, if you want to rebuild a road, you have no other choice. The other issue we had back then was it was typically just a Northern Virginia and a Hampton Roads. If people are watching this from outside Virginia, it's Virginia Beach, Norfolk area. Those are the only two places that had the transportation problems that were acute. And that meant that anybody else from the rest of the state wasn't going to raise taxes and send it to Northern Virginia. And I don't blame them. Why would they? I mean, my friends out in Southern Virginia said transportation's at the bottom of the list of needs. I need jobs. Up where we are in Northern Virginia, transportation was number one, and we had plenty of jobs. So that wasn't on our list. So you had to try to figure out a way. One of the rules I had as a legislator is you can never make anybody do something they don't want to do. You can't. You had to figure out ways to get people to do things because they want to, or do it in a way that doesn't affect them. So we came up with this idea that we would let Northern Virginia raise its own money under the non-negotiable rule that 100% of the money stays in Northern Virginia.
Good.
And just to make sure I wasn't going to lose an election over it, I polled it. And apparently, because life was so miserable, driving an hour and a half to work every day, that the vast majority of my constituents, I think the number is in the 70s, 70% plus, were willing to raise taxes under the non-negotiable rule that 100% stayed in Northern Virginia.
You polled it. You asked your residents how they would feel about a tax increase.
Oh, you got to be careful. This was a very risky thing for a Republican to do, is to raise taxes. I never thought I was really raising taxes, really. I always looked at it as adjusting for inflation. Had the gas tax been adjusted for inflation since it was raised in 1987, we wouldn't have had this problem at all.
Let me dissect a couple of things here. The way the budget shortfall was actually affecting people in the community, what did it look like for them? Was this just traffic on the freeways? What was the issue?
It's traffic, but it's more than that. It's like a quality of life thing. Like it got to the point where it took me an hour and a half to go 13 miles. And I was a coach for my kids' soccer team. I couldn't get back in time to coach the team. And that was just Dave Albo's story. What about the working mom who's got to pick their kid up at daycare, or they pay some kind of insane penalty? It was just miserable. It's in a weird way, it's a good problem to have. It means we have a strong economy. We have a lot of people who need to get places because they've got decent jobs. So, but the infrastructure just wasn't there. And the fact that I could not put a single stoplight in the entire state of Virginia is indicative of a huge problem.
Yeah, a huge bottleneck going on there. As a legislator, what kind of pressures were you receiving? You polled people, but were residents calling you up, constituents calling you up and demanding that the legislature do something about
Yeah.
the traffic situation?
Perfect example is there's a intersection in Rolling Road in Barnack. I know you don't know where that is, but was in my district, and people couldn't make a left turn. And they lived in this area where they had to get on this rolling road in order to get to work or even get to the grocery store. Couldn't make a left turn because there's no stoplight there. And so your constituents call up and they complain. What kind of answer is, I'm sorry, I can't get enough money to put one stoplight in? And that's why many Republicans in Northern Virginia voted for this and helped us draft it because they were getting the same kind of pressure too.
This is about practicality, not about ideology.
Mm-hmm. And politics works. I know it's people don't believe it, but legislators listen to their constituents. If the constituents will take the time to tastefully write, email, call, talk to, they listen. And when you start getting enough people who are upset about an issue, the legislator is going to react.
You mentioned this challenge of balancing interests in the state and trying to get legislators representing the southern part of the state to appreciate the need for this in Northern Virginia. Two questions come to mind. The first is, my understanding is that Northern Virginia operates as a huge economic engine for the entire state. Is that enough of an argument for people who are decision makers outside of Northern Virginia to say, yes, we'll vote for the funding up there because we know it fuels the state as a whole?
You'd think so, but that never works.
Really?
Yeah, never works. Never.
Why not? Doesn't the math work?
Well, yeah, but they don't care. It doesn't directly benefit them. It's an indirect benefit. What helped with that bill was a event. So I remember I was telling you I was working on this thing for like 8 years. Well, one of the bills that we put in, I think it was Tom Rust put this bill in, said, okay, if you're not going to give us more money for transportation, we're going to take the existing pie and we're cutting a larger slice for us, Northern Virginia. And he directed a bunch of the existing transportation money to Northern Virginia. And it passed the House by one vote. And then all the delegates from Southern Virginia were like, oh, wait. If we don't solve Northern Virginia's problem, they're coming after our pie. And that bill got killed in the Senate. But that was a seminal moment in this long history of this bill when Southern Virginia people realized that the population shifts in Northern Virginia, Virginia Beach, were eventually going to lead to one of two things. Either they're taking our money or we need to let them solve their own problem. And after that, we started having some success. Like I said, you can't get anybody to do something they don't want to do. You got to figure out a way to get them to do it because they want to do it.
The other question I was going to ask you is, last spring, maybe 5 or 6 months ago now, in one of these episodes, I got to interview Speaker Don Scott. And one of the questions, we actually had a live audience joining us for the Zoom conversation. And I remember one of the questions that came up to the speaker was, as he was looking at budget opportunities, was there a way to designate funding that came from Northern Virginia to stay in Northern Virginia? And I can't quote it directly off the top of my head, but my recollection is he kind of had an allergic reaction to that suggestion and, would not even go there, would not even put on the table a consideration of something like that. So the ability to retain those monies in Northern Virginia, was that a pretty special one-time thing that happened with the transportation?
It was the linchpin to the group. We had Mark Sickles, Vivian Watts, me, Tom Rust. The list is long of people, but that was the key thing. But see, we weren't taking existing money and keeping it. We were willing to tax ourselves with new funds. So we raised our sales tax slightly. We raised the titling tax when you buy a car, raised rental car fees, raised hotel fees, and we put it into this fund that stayed in Northern Virginia. So it's a little bit different than the question that Speaker Scott got, which is, can we just keep some of this money that was supposed to go to the state. Ours was new money. One of the keys was making sure it couldn't be stolen. So here's something, a legislative drafting thing that I came up with at the time. So every year someone could say, notwithstanding that law that says you can't take our money, we're going to take your money. And because the newer law supersedes the older law, right? So I wrote this thing called the kill switch. And what the kill switch says is if anybody does that, then these tax sources automatically are repealed. So it doesn't stop somebody from saying, notwithstanding the law that says you get to keep the hotel tax, I'm taking your hotel tax. That could be done, but then the hotel tax no longer exists the next year because it's automatically repealed. So that's why we came up with the kill switch idea. And no one's violated it. This thing's been in place since 2013, and the money has been rock solid going to Northern Virginia.
Dave, tell me, this sounds like it was a huge negotiation and involved a lot of creativity and innovative thinking. What did this process teach you about coalition building or negotiating, especially when it's across geography and political divides?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was not easy. And one of the reasons we were successful is because the Speaker of the House at the time, Bill Howe, eventually got on board. He was very much of an anti-tax guy, I think, and I wouldn't put words in his mouth, but he's probably starting to get the same kind of pressures that we were getting because he was representing an area that was becoming suburban at the time. And the main thing was that we didn't make anybody do anything to themselves they didn't like. So if you're in Southern Virginia and you didn't want to raise your hotel tax for roads, you didn't have to do it. Only the people who wanted to do it. And I remember it took a lot of talking and a lot of listening. If somebody wanted something, we tried to accommodate them if they were going to vote for the bill, though, of course. You always have some knuckleheads that get you to change a bill and then they don't vote for it, which I think is a legislative no-no. That happens. But it took, and this is not like it's not like we came up with this idea and passed it in 1 year. It took, like I said, from the time we thought of it, 8 years until the time it got passed.
Dave, what do you say to a Republican, whether they're in a state legislature or even though they're nonpartisan races, someone who has conservative leanings, who serves on a city council, for example, who is just naturally allergic to anything that looks like a tax increase? What do you say to them to get them to the point of view of saying, well, I still need to invest in my community and we have to find a way to fund it?
Well, what we did was, listen, I'm allergic to taxes. I still am, and I'm not even elected to anything. But I looked at every other way to solve the problem. I had a problem that needed to be solved. And I spent years trying to find cuts in the budget like I discussed before, find ways to divert other people's money to Northern Virginia. And there was just no way. And remember, this is also kind of following the financial recession of 2008. So it wasn't, and growth wasn't happening. We couldn't take any surpluses and put them in transportation because there was no surpluses. So when some of my Republican friends said, I'm not going to do it, I said, okay, that's great. What's your idea? And they didn't have an idea. Then, some of my Republican friends didn't vote for it. It wasn't important enough to their constituents. The other thing I tell the people, I don't know if it's kind of related to your question, is what it say? You got 2 ears and 1 mouth and use your ears. You should use your ears twice as much. That's kind of what we did. There's a really great story there's this woman named Vivian Watts, who most people who are watching this will know her. And we were meeting as Republicans trying to figure out how much money these different funding sources would bring in. And we didn't have the talent. And Vivian, who had been former Secretary of Transportation and got back in the House of Delegates, we knew she'd know it. And so us Republican guys said, I think we need to start bringing Democrat Vivian Watts into our meeting here because she's the only one who's going to know it. And she was an absolute linchpin to the whole thing. In fact, when I was talking to her recently, I think she nailed the numbers within 1% 5 years later. So we took a lot, just like I said, listened to everybody, tried to use different people's talents. I remember Mark Sickles was there. He was in appropriations at the time. He was very helpful. I hate to list names because there's so many people who were cooks in the kitchen.
Was there blowback afterward for you? Were there constituents who said, you're supposed to stand for no taxes and you voted for this? And even though you said I looked at every other option and I felt this was the only way forward, people who just didn't believe you.
I'm sure there was, but you have never heard my joke, but everybody listening to this has heard it. I was 12 years in the House of Delegates, undefeated and unindicted. And so I managed to survive many elections after doing this. And I would actually argue that when I got that stoplight put on Barnack and Rolling Road, it did more for my election than voting for a tax increase hurt it.
Looking back, what did the experience teach you about the balance between holding to principles and adapting to practical realities and the needs of your constituents?
Well, that's interesting. And I wouldn't really consider a rule that I don't raise taxes as a principle. My principle is that I need to get to work and people need to get to daycare and I got a problem to solve. And I looked at every single option and there was only one solution. And it wasn't anybody's fault because they had never indexed gas tax to inflation. A lot of my Republican friends who got mad about raising taxes, I said, if you add all this up, it doesn't take any more money out of people's pockets indexed to inflation than it did in 1987. And had we indexed it to inflation, we never would have had the problem.
Okay, Dave, let's fast forward to today. As I understand it, the General Assembly is wrestling with everything from budget pressures to partisan veto fights, debates over constitutional rights, and more urgent infrastructure needs. When you look back at the transportation funding battle of 2013, what lessons from that experience do you think should be remembered and might still be useful today as the legislature takes on these kinds of challenges?
Well, number one is to listen to the other side first. Find out a lot of times, I said this in my retirement speech, just because the other party comes up, has a position on something doesn't mean it's stupid automatically. They probably identified a real problem. You may not like the way they try to solve it. So that's why we go back to what we were talking about earlier about you got 2 ears and one mouth, so you use your ears twice as much. And I see that, I'm a backbencher now. I kind of observing. As a lobbyist, I don't have a vote, but I sit there in these meetings sometimes and I hear people talking and I said, they're talking past each other. No one's listening to each other. They're just throwing talking points at each other and no one's listening because the solution is obvious and it's halfway between point A and halfway between point B. So that's the only thing that I kind of realize now.
When you were a legislator or as a outside lobbyist?
As an outside lobbyist, I see it more now because I'm not in the battle.
Yeah.
I'm not in the Republican versus Democrat thing anymore. I'm in the citizen thing, just watching. And it seems to me that I hear more people slinging talking points than solutions. The other thing I tell you is I've met hundreds, maybe thousands of elected people in my career. And 99.99% of them are super nice. No one goes to Richmond to be a delegate for $17,640 a year to get ahead. Because it is a true community service. And once you understand that everybody's got the same goal and everybody in the end wants to get to the same place, it kind of helps you find solutions by just listening more and trying to take the good parts of everybody's arguments and put them into one bill. I think that's what this 2013 transportation bill did. It took ideas from all over the state and all the people and put it into one bill. A good example would be Hampton Roads wanted to copy our idea, and they did in that bill, but they had different funding sources they needed. They didn't want to tax hotels because hotels at the time was it's a beach town, it's a tourism town. So they chose other types of funding mechanisms. And we just said, you guys live in a different place. I don't understand what it's like to live in Hampton Roads area. Why don't you solve your problem and bring it to us, and then we'll implement what you want, instead of trying to shove a solution down everybody's throat.
So it's 2025. the transportation battle was 12 years ago.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if you would reflect on the effect of social media and how, even in the last 12 years, that's changed the calculus of politics, and whether you felt it then, and whether it's changed the environment that allows people of different parties to come together and talk now.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my bill ended up not solving all problems. I'm not trying to overblow it. The legislature came back, I think, in 2020, and then again in 2024, and added money to fund transportation. So I don't want anybody to think that I think I solved transportation. I got to tell you, I got into the House of Delegates in '94. The internet existed, but it really wasn't robust at all. I remember there's only a few web pages, and we were just starting to use email. Back then, if there was a tough issue and someone found out about it, they'd have to save up $100 to send 40 angry postcards to people. Then the internet happened, email and blogs and listservs started happening. And now angry people could just spew out a bunch of crap. I hate to use the word, but that's the only thing I can think of, and didn't have to put their name behind it. And now with social media, I think it's even worse. It would have been very difficult to pass this 2013 bill nowadays, because at every step of the process of trying to find a compromise, we would have gotten just annihilated by bloggers and social media people. For example, let's just say, hey, I'm against raising taxes, but I might consider it under the non-negotiable rule that 100% stays in my neighborhood. At that point, nowadays, these people get on, they start, Dave Albo's a rhino, he's going to raise taxes, and they won't mention anything about the fact there's no other way to solve the problem, et cetera. And then so at every point in the negotiation, legislators are getting beat up. Back in the old days, in Dave Albo's time in the 1990s, you only had to answer for the final product. But now you have to deal with the grief at every single stage of the bill. And it is, I feel for people who are legislators now, because it is really difficult.
Is it difficult, or is it actually impossible?
Oh, it's impossible because no one puts their names by anything. And you also don't know who sent it to whom. I mean, how do I know what constituents heard the lie about the bill? It's very difficult. On the other hand, the internet has made everybody accountable. So nowadays, you push your finger on a yes or no button, your constituents are going to know what it is. And so legislators can't hide behind, phrases they're whipping out, because they're the only people who have the bully pulpit. Everybody gets to know what you do. So I think the process is more honest now, but good things and bad things about the internet.
Do you have a story to share about reaching across the aisle and getting to a better outcome? Can you help us understand what the noble version of that kind of collaboration should look like?
I'm trying to think of that. We used to reach across the aisle all the time in the Courts of Justice Committee, because everybody didn't want people to get murdered and killed and drunk drivers to hit them, et cetera. So we all had the common goal. Once we knew there was a common goal, then it was really about what the words are and what the solution is. That was an everyday occurrence in the Courts of Justice Committee. I had to put my thinking cap on. Well, the best example of bipartisan cooperation, of course, is this bill we've been talking about. And the fact that, we would call Democrat Mark Sickles and Democrat Vivian Watts and others, hey, can you come meet with us and help us? Because we're trying to solve the problem.
Dave, on this podcast, thanks in part to the sponsorship from RELI, I've had this chance to talk with civic leaders from throughout Northern Virginia, from school boards to cities and counties, and obviously in the legislature as well. I'm curious for your perspective on the significance of the collaborative spirit that seems to exist in Northern Virginia. It is different. It is unique from what happens in many other parts of the country. Can you explain to someone who doesn't understand the ecosystem of Northern Virginia why that collaboration seems to work?
Well, let's all remember now that there are no Republicans left in Northern Virginia except for Pat Harity. So you don't have the political infighting, because there are no Republicans left. It's almost all Democrats. But even amongst the Democrats, especially across jurisdictions, they all seem to get along because they have common problems. The transportation is the perfect example of the common problem. Right now, we have the common problem of all the federal government job layoffs.
Yes.
And how that's going to really hit. It hasn't hit yet, but it's going to hit people's tax revenues because, you get tens of thousands of people who lose $140,000 a year job. That's a pretty big hit on the income tax revenue for the state. And then they move out of town, and now there's no real estate tax. And then you're no longer going to work, so you don't need commercial office buildings anymore. So now they don't have any money for tax revenue from commercial office buildings. So I think that the reason that the Northern Virginia people elected leaders tend to collaborate is just Dave Albo's opinion, is because they have common problems. And so they're all trying to solve the same problem.
Looking back, Dave, on 3 decades in public service and now advising organizations, what's the single most important lesson that you would offer a new public leader about balancing their own values and being open to other perspectives?
I guess there's 2 ways to be a legislator. One is to go down there and do what you want and figure people voted for you to use your best judgment and to do what you want. I happen to be on the other side of that. I don't think that what Dave Albo wants matters at all. I'm there to do what the vast majority of my constituents want me to do. And so and this is also the lawyer thing in it. You're an advocate for your client. So that's how I usually held it. But again, we had talked about this a couple times. My advice is to listen more than you talk, and you will find a solution if you know that all the best ideas aren't in your own brain.
Dave Albo, thank you very much for this conversation. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, it's fun going down memory lane. So I appreciated the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thanks again to my guest, Dave Albo, former member of the Virginia House of Delegates and now government relations attorney with Williams-Mullen. And thank you again to RELI, the Regional Elected Leaders Initiative at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, for their sponsorship of this episode. Listening to Dave, I'm struck by how leadership requires both principle and pragmatism. Sometimes truly conservative means embracing something somewhat innovative. Sometimes listening to political rivals reveals a problem worth solving. And always, leadership demands the discipline to read carefully, listen closely, and act responsibly. And that reflection leads me to this week's candid question for all community leaders. Think of a time you worked with someone you usually disagreed with. What made it possible to find a solution together? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Call 602-688-2724 and leave me a message. By sharing your answer, you deepen this leadership conversation, and your response may be featured in a future episode. And while you're at it, if you'd be open to sharing the stories and lessons of your own journey to leadership, click the podcast guest link in the show notes. Your hard-earned insights may offer precisely the knowledge and encouragement another community leader needs to hear right now. Community Catalysts is edited by Nick, Living the Dream Tantillo. Our executive producer is John Little. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with another Community Catalyst.